Thank you all for coming. It's good to see you all. This is the last in our current series before the Tisha B'Av break. Sometimes in past years we've had another shir before Tisha B'Av, but this year we do not, which means we have a long list of dedications that I need to read out of special sponsorship for the shiurim in no specific order. So the shiurim, the learning today, all day, this Wednesday, is sponsored by Mark and Deborah Zohar for the Yortzites of Mark's parents, Kalman Chaim Ben Tzvi. The Yortzeit is on the 2nd of Av, on Sunday, and Esther Bat Moshe on the 4th of Av. Are the Zohars here? Thank you very much for the sponsorship. The shiurim are also sponsored specifically today by Chaim and Sheila Liebtag. Thank you very much for the sponsorship in memory of Sheila's mother, Chaya Etel Bas David, whose Yortzeit is today. And the shir today is also sponsored by Miriam, who regularly sponsors this time of year in the memory of her mother, Liba Pesha Bas Moshe, Alei Shalom, whose Yortzeit is on the 7th of Av next week, which is the 8th Yortzeit, and also her grandfather, Nachum Ben Moshe, whose Yortzeit is on the 9th of Av on Tisha B'Av itself, and it's his 70th Yortzeit this year. And the shiurim are sponsored for the whole of the 2025 academic year in memory of Zelig Ben Kalman and also Brana Bas Brandit. All those people that I've mentioned, Zichronam Livracha, their neshama should have an aliyah. It should be an opportunity for us to learn Torah in their schut. I would also just mention my own grandmother's Yortzeit is on Monday, which is the 3rd of Av, and her name is Toiba Bas Avraham, also Zichronam Livracha. We should learn good Torah in their merit. Now, today I'm fulfilling a promise that I made to Amy a while back that I would do a shir on hearing aids on Shabbat, specifically focused on charging hearing aids on Shabbat. I might just mention to turn off your phones, please. I can already hear something bleeping and beeping. So something's beeping. I think the lady's dealing with it there. Sometimes these bleeps have a mind of their own. So I'm focusing today specifically on the issue of charging, although I will be talking about other things as well. We gave a series of shiurim a while back, and these shiurim are available on my website, also on the OU website. We gave a series on microphones on Shabbat. I don't know if you remember that series. It was a 3-part series, and we dealt with some of the hearing aid issues, but this year goes well beyond that, and I've brought you a little bit of recap as well. So I brought you on the first page a couple of pictures of hearing aids. The top one is an old-fashioned hearing aid that you will remember, which is very hard to come by these days, which basically works like a microphone with an amplifier, a battery, a receiver, and a little output. They can be analog, they can be digital. And as we all know, they tended to go wrong quite a lot and whistle quite a lot in the middle of everything, and you end up having to work out how to stop the whistling, etc. Modern day hearing aids are much more complicated, as everything is. And here's a picture of, no doubt, a very oversimplified picture of what goes into a modern hearing aid. The technology is somewhat different these days, and they have lots of extra features. Of course, they're all digital. They're not analog anymore. They have features such as noise filtering, directional focus, automatic volume adjustments, synchronization between the hearing aids, meaning they're talking to each other. Also, you can live stream Bluetooth direct from your radio, from your phone, from your TV, from your screen, straight into your earphones, into your hearing aids rather, and also earphones, but straight into your hearing aids. So there's a lot of complicated technology going on. The halachic issues, which we're not going to deal with all of them, but some of them are listed here. First of all, are you allowed to wear them on Shabbat? Yes is the answer, and we'll talk about what the issues are there. Do they need to be switched on before Shabbat, or can they be activated on Shabbat? We'll see preferably switched on before, but there are ways to deal with that on Shabbat. Can they be charged on Shabbat? We'll talk about that in some detail. Whether the charging cradle is attached to the mains, or it's an independent power pack, battery-powered cradle. And then in the modern models, there's lots of beeping and lights and flickering and different colors. How does that all work as well? There are some other issues in terms of carrying them in a place where there's no eruv. Is that okay? Yes is a short answer. We're not going to be dealing with this in detail. The muksa status of hearing aids, we'll see that they're not muksa, and various other things as well. I've brought you on the first page in the footnotes some statistics. There's a lot of people in the world who wear hearing aids, and there's an awful lot more people who need to wear hearing aids. There still seems to be something of a stigma in people's minds. They don't have a problem wearing spectacles, but hearing aids somehow or other are difficult to adjust to in terms of sort of the psychology. And there is actually a much larger percentage of people need hearing aids than actually have hearing aids. And in America alone, we're talking about millions upon millions of people, tens of millions of people. I brought you a couple of references to some very good articles. A recent article, Rabbi Asher Bush, who I actually met just now in America, he wrote an article recently called The Use of Hearing Aids on Shabbos and Yom Tov, Issues Relating to Charging or Recharging the Batteries. That's a 2024 essay, so it's pretty up to date on the technology. Now, I summarize a little bit for you Rav Feinstein on microphones in the footnote. I'm not going to get into that in too much detail, but it's obviously relevant. Rav Moshe Feinstein passed very clearly that you can't use microphones on Shabbat. And his reasons for that we'll see soon. There were two definite D'Rabbanan concerns he had and some possible D'Oraitas. But he very much differentiated between microphones and hearing aids. Even though hearing aid technology to some degree involves the same shilas, for reasons that we'll see, he felt that they were very different. Microphones interfered with the spirit of Shabbat. He was under no pressure to in any way permit microphones. In many ways, they differentiated between Orthodox and conservative shuls in America, and therefore he came down pretty clearly that microphones are not allowed, even though there have been attempts to create Shabbos-friendly microphones. Tzomet created a Shabbos-friendly microphone, but it just hasn't caught on. I don't think I've been to a single shul with a Shabbos-friendly microphone, even though people have Shabbat-friendly little sort of buggies that they ride around and all sorts of other things. Somehow or other, microphones in shul is that kind of hashkafic dividing line. I'm in an Orthodox shul, there shouldn't be a microphone. Loop systems that they used to have with the old hearing aids, I think they still do have. Yes, they definitely have those induction loop systems, but microphones we don't seem to have. But we'll have a look at Rav Moshe in a minute. Just turn over to page 2, and we'll have a look at some of the initial categorization questions about hearing aids. So the first question we need to ask ourselves is, what is the halachic category or status of a person who is hard of hearing, who is hearing impaired, and they need to wear a hearing aid? Is this person considered to be sick or ill in some way on Shabbat? Obviously, that's very important, because if we categorize someone as a choleh, then there are all sorts of halachic dispensations that they will have on Shabbat. So let's just review together very briefly the categories of illness on Shabbat. There are basically 5. They range in increasing severity from the most minor, which is a michush ba'alma, someone who has some minor aches and pains, we'll talk about what they are in a minute, to someone who has a miktzat choli, they have a specifically painful thing, but they're still functioning fine, to someone who is a choleh, or cholah, she'ein bo sakana, someone who is sick but not dangerously so, and we'll define that in a few minutes. The next level up is someone who, lo aleinu, has sakanat evel, that they're in danger of losing a limb, an arm, a leg, a finger, whatever it is, an eye, God forbid. It used to be that this was, in halacha, quite distinct from pikuach nefesh, which is the highest category, someone who's in life-threatening danger, and they categorize them differently. Today, I'm not giving a whole share on this, but sakanat eva, because of the concerns for internal bleeding, which people didn't necessarily know about so much hundreds of years ago, most cases of sakanat eva, where people are in danger of losing a limb, are also, at least at the beginning of their diagnosis, potentially pikuach nefesh as well, until they've established that this person is not in any life danger, but there is just a question of saving the limb. And then, of course, there's the choleh sheyesh bo sakana, someone who is in life-threatening danger. So let's just look at the 2 categories we're really dealing with. The first one, number 1, is the Shulchan Aruch on someone who has a minor ache and pain. It says as follows: Mi sheyesh lo mechush ba'alma, someone who has an irritation, a minor ailment. V'hu mitchazek, but they're basically feeling fine, they're feeling strong. V'holech kebari, and they're walking around like a regular healthy person, but there's something that's annoying them. Asur la'asot lo shum refuah. They're not allowed to do any kind of healing or medication on Shabbos. Hafilu al yidei ein Yehudi, they can't even ask a non-Jew to do anything. Gezeira mishum shchikat kat samamanim, because we are worried that people, the classic formulation, will come to grind the medication. Medication was, and to some degree still is, it's just we don't grind it today unless you have a homeopathic medication kit in your bathroom. Most people don't grind their own medicine, but a lot of medicine is still ground into tablets. And the concern was people are going to grind something and then break Shabbos on a Torah level. Now, Rav Moshe Feinstein has a very important tshuva on this, and he says it's not just an issue of grinding, because this is the halacha that everybody loves to be irritated by. Like, really, Rabbi, I don't grind anything, nobody grinds anything, I've got a headache, okay, it's a minor headache, but why can't I just take a tablet? Rav Moshe said, because everybody knows that pikuach nefesh sets aside Shabbos, so whenever anyone feels sick, there's always this temptation to say, oh, could be pikuach nefesh, especially with Jews. They tend to get a bit dramatic about things sometimes. And people are going to say, well, of course Shabbos can't apply. I need to take a tablet. I need to do this. And this halacha is just saying, slow down. Just 1 second. It's not just about grinding. People might come to cook something. They might make something with the hot water in a different way than normal. And this halacha is just telling you, just take a step back. Is it just a minor ache and pain? If so, let's not do any kind of medication just to reinforce that this is not a case of pikuach nefesh. We'll see once that we get into a real choleh, there are a number of real halachic changes. But someone has a minor ailment, and I listed some examples. This is not obviously exhaustive. Indigestion, minor stomachache, a slight, ear ache, but not a serious one. A minor headache, like an insect bite or a sting, something minor. A bit of muscle pain, a bit of skin, chapped skin, something like that. A minor cold, a sore throat, a bruise, a minor burn, something like that. The general halacha is they can't do anything which requires medication on Shabbos. Now, there are many exceptions to that rule, and this is not a share of this on this in detail. If the sufferer is in general poor health or weak, which sometimes is the case with elderly people, not always, then that's not just considered a minor thing. It could become more major. Children, maybe even to the age of 9, certainly when they're little and they can't explain what's wrong with them, we treat everything as potentially more serious, where a condition is expected to deteriorate into something more serious. So there are many exceptions, but that's the general rule for a mechush ba'alma. There are also exceptions if you're on a course of medication, if you started your antibiotics, you have to finish them, etc. This is not the occasion to talk about that in detail. But when you're talking about someone who's a real choleh, not a dangerously ill person, but a sick person, how are we defining that? Number 2. Choleh shenafal machmat chalav lemishkav. Somebody who is bedridden. Should be a Yiddish word, bedridden, but it's bedridden. It's an English word, okay? Someone who is taken to their bed because they feel ill. They're not life-threateningly ill. Ve'ein bo sakana. There's no danger of them dying. So the first category is someone who's just gone to bed because they just don't feel well, okay? Then the Ramah says, O sheyesh lo meichush shemitzta'er. Or they have a pain or an illness or an ailment which is really hurting them, and they feel sort of systematically sick from it. They have a fever. It's not just a sore throat. They just feel under the weather, where everyone knows exactly what that feels like. Just they feel that they're sick with something. Even though he might be forcing himself to get around, or herself, okay, I'm going to battle through it. They should probably be in bed. The fact that they're up and around, they're still a choleh, because they're still sick. They're just trying to put a brave face on it. So what do we say with this kind of person? And we'll see some of those examples soon. So Omrim le'einu Yehudi la'asat refuah. So the first thing is, everybody agrees, every opinion agrees here. You can ask a non-Jew to do anything you like on Shabbos directly. Please do this, please do that. Even if it's a Torah prohibition, as it were, that the non-Jewish person will be doing, cooking, turning on the lights, a person who is a choleh, even though they're not dangerously sick, but they're systematically sick, can ask a non-Jew to do anything. What about more than that? You can't obviously do an issa d'oraisa. You're not, God forbid, life-threateningly sick. You can only ask a non-Jew. What else? And there is another level, that maybe you can also, there is a yesh matirin, you can yourself do a rabbinic prohibition. Directly, because of the person, either for the person who's sick or the person themselves. The yesh omrim, and there is a third opinion here, so oisim b'shinui. No, when you're doing your drabanon, you have to do it with a shinui a little bit differently. V'divrei hasvara hashlishit nirin, and he paskins like that last opinion. So again, of the 3 options, I've simplified it a little bit on the page. The 3 options. Everyone agrees you can ask a non-Jew if a person is a choleh. Everyone agrees that you can do some kind of d'Rabbanan. The question is, can you do it with a shinui, or can you do it even without a shinui? So he paskins that you do the drabonon with the shinui, which by the way is a good reason to remember why you have to know your doraisis from your drabonons on Shabbos. If you just have one big kind of cholent in your head and you think, well, this is mutter and this is osa and I don't really know why, then you won't be able to keep Shabbos. You have to know this is doraita, this is drabonon, this is called a shinui. You have to be an intelligently educated Jew on Shabbos. And we paskin like that third opinion the Mishnah Berurah says, Hainu shumutal asois afilu kol hashvusim, you can do all drabonons, v'rak al yedei shinui, but you have to use a shinui. The Ken Kosov Hagra, and he writes here that this is the psak of the Gra, Shedei zo ika shehidat rov haposkim. And he brings that down as the view of most poskim. So where does that leave us? Go to page 3. That if you are a chole on Shabbat, you can break a rabbinic prohibition with a shinui, and maybe even without a shinui. If you follow that the other opinion, which maybe we'll be able to rely on. Don't forget, when the Shulchan Aruch includes opinions that he says we don't necessarily follow, that means that those opinions are there, they're not irrelevant, and you can rely on them in a situation of need. So use a shinui wherever you can, but if it's not possible and you really need to, then possibly without. Simon, you had a question?
Yeah, where does you categorize my disability?
Okay.
Where does disability?
Okay, so let's talk about that now. Let's talk about that right now. So who is a choleh she'ein bo sakana? What does it mean, disability, in this sense? So I brought you on the top of page 3 a few types of different categories of someone who is a choleh. They're sick enough to have to go to bed. We've already seen that. They can't function. If they were at work, they said, I'm sorry, I have to go home, I have to lie down, I can't stay here anymore. That's usually a good test between a choleh she'ein bo sakana and a michush ba'alma. If you were at work, and you didn't particularly want to take the time off, would you say, you know something, I'll manage till I go home tonight? Or would you say to your boss, look, I'm really sorry, I don't feel well, I have to go to bed? If the latter, then you're probably a choleh. Or someone who should be in bed, but they're forcing themselves. Also, we'll see soon, someone who cannot function normally. They can't eat, they can't speak, they can't walk. Meaning someone who has slight, canker sores in their mouth and it just hurts a little bit is a mechush ba'alma. Somebody whose mouth is so sore that they can't physically eat is a choleh already, they can't eat. Someone who's coming down with a sickness that they're going to become a choleh, etc., etc. Someone who's awaiting a diagnosis, a small child, we talked about that. Special halachas for women who have just given birth in the last month as well. And I brought you some examples. Again, I'm not a doctor. This is not an exhaustive list rather. But some things which are definitely a choleh, and they're not just a mechush ba'alma. Asthma, a bee sting for, obviously an asthma could be life-threatening in certain situations as well, but in a case where it's not. A bee sting for a child is a serious issue. A bad burn, the flu, diabetes, again, obviously could be life-threatening in other situations, and I'm not going to read through all of these. Things like a fever, pneumonia, strep infection, etc., etc. What can one do? So we've said. So you can ask a non-Jew to do whatever you want. You can do whatever you need to do, which is drabonon with a shinui. You obviously can take the medication. And maybe you can do it even without a shinui. But what you can't do is break a Torah mitzvah. Now we come to number 3. Because jumps in the Shulchan Aruch Harav. And this is not just the opinion of the Shulchan Aruch Harav. And you'll see where this is going to take us in terms of charging your hearing aids. The Shulchan Aruch Harav, the Alter Rebbe, and this is also the opinion of the Eglei Tal and others, which we'll see at the end of the shir, says I'll add an extra thing on that a choleh she'ein bo sakana can do, which is they can even do a Torah prohibition, but with a shinui. Now, the Shulchan Aruch never said that. He said a drabonon with a shinui. Excuse me. A drabonon maybe even without a shinui. Excuse me. But who said you can do a Torah prohibition with a shinoi? Look at number 3. If there's no danger to any kind of limb, life or limb, but you had to go to bed, or you feel systematically, all sick all over, systemically I should say, not systematically. If you want to do a drabanon, you can, but you have to use a shinui. B'shinui derech hachol, different from the weekday. Now we'll see. Shinuyim don't come all in the same way. How are you going to charge your hearing aids with a shinui? What are you going to do? You're going to do it with your nose? You're going to do it with your knuckles? We're going to get to that. We'll have to see how that's going to work. So yes, he goes like the Shulchan Aruch, and then he says, "Va'al yidei shinui," and if you really use a proper shinui, mutar la'asos afilu melacha gemura. You can even do a Torah prohibition as long as you use your shinui. Now that's much further than the Shulchan Aruch went. And that's a minority opinion. And we'll see soon that the Mishnah Brura is very unhappy to paskin like that opinion. And therefore, most poskim will not go to that place and say you can do a Torah prohibition even with a shinui if you're only a chola. Obviously, it's someone whose life is not at risk. If their life is at risk, there's nothing to talk about. We will see, however, that Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was more open to this particular approach than many other poskim, and therefore we'll see that it gained traction in other issues in modern day life. Okay, good. So far, the categorization, we've got our michush ba'alma, we've got a chole, what can you do for a chole, etc. What is hearing impairment? On what level do we place this? Is it a minor thing? You say, well, it's actually a major thing, I can't hear anything. But are you sick? Are you ill? Do you fit into any of these categorizations? You don't feel like you need to go to bed, you're not in any pain, you just can't hear properly. So the Shmir Shabbos Kilchaso, number 4, says as follows. Im nigmaru hasolalot b'Shabbat. If your hearing aid batteries go down, decharge on Shabbos, ein lahachlifan ba'achirot. You may not change the batteries for other batteries. We'll see why soon. Ach mutar lirmoiz lenachri v'hu yachlifotam. You can hint to a non-Jew, and the non-Jew can change the batteries for you. Now, that's very interesting. You can hint to a non-Jew. It's clear that he's holding here that a hearing impaired person is not a chola. If they were a chola, they could say directly to a non-Jew. That's the first thing that everybody agreed on. When it comes to a chola, they can ask directly. When we say ask, I mean ask directly. He said, no, you have to hint. Exactly how you hint. We talked about that 2 weeks ago, etc. This is actually quite a machmir psak, and already Rav Herschel Schechter and Rav Mordechai Willig and many other poskim I've listed in the footnotes as well rule that no, a person on Shabbos who is not able to function, and this, Simon, is kind of your question, even if they're not sick but they're not functional. They may have a bad leg, which means they can't walk. They may not actually be in pain right now, and they may not feel like they need to go to bed, but they can't function, and therefore they say a hearing impaired person is definitely a chola she'ein bo sakana. And I brought you some of the sources on that. I actually heard this also from Rav David Miller, who is the head of the Grus Kollel and was the Rav in Ateret Nof. In Haranof, when we lived in Haranof, and I asked him a few times about the categorization of a chola, and he said anyone who is not functional in the way that a normal person would in society is called a chola. Now, once you get that in terms of hearing impairment, then now the door is open to some new ways of doing things on Shabbos. So what are we going to be able to do? Let's assume that we're paskening like that position, which I think is a fairly majority position. We're going to be able to do Isurei D'Rabbanan with a shinui. Okay, so we have to work out what is, maybe even without a shinui, if we in a bind, and maybe even we'll see if we're going to rely on that other minority opinion, a Torah prohibition with a shinui. We'll see if we can rely on that. I'm not going to go into too much detail on page number 4 because this we did in the previous series, even though it was like 5 years ago. But you can pick it up online. But I brought you in number 5 and 6 and 7, Rav Moshe's tshuva on microphones and what his problem was. He was worried about the electricity, yes, although at the end of the day he said for a person with a hearing aid, we don't have to assume that the electricity itself presents a problem. But he had 2 rabbinic issues which he said are definitely things we have to consider. One is afsha milta. We talked about this last week. Things that make a noise on Shabbos. He said a microphone is a perfect example of afsha milta. People turn them on Shabbos. Remember the whole problem with things that make noises. People are going to assume, he just did it on Shabbos, which is why we said that air conditioners which are on a timer, etc., are not a problem. Microphones are not on a timer. People turn them on, they make a lot of noise. That's definitely a problem. He said, hearing aids? They don't make any noise. I mean, every now and then they whistle. But But he said that's not called an isser of avsha milta. That's something every now and then might emit a slight, whining noise. He says that's not a problem. He dismisses that, and he says hearing aids we're not going to say is a problem because of avsha milta. But more of a problem is, what about shemi yitaken kli? Maybe you're going to fix them, and I want to look at this with you in number 6 in more detail, because this is fascinating in terms of the halachic process. He says the second reason, number 6 here, v'hatam, the kivan shehakol yicholim letaken, since everybody knows how to fix their hearing aids, and hearing aids often go wrong, meaning if it was something that if it's broken only a professional can fix, then you're not going to have a problem on Shabbos, because we're not worried that people might come to fix it. People don't know how to fix it. But hearing aids is, anyone can fix the hearing aid. And therefore, just like you're not allowed to play a musical instrument on Shabbos, you should not be able to use a hearing aid either, because you might come to play with it, to change it, to fix it. Because it's very common, shemit kalkel, that they break, they go wrong, and you'll come to fix them, and that's a problem on Shabbos. That could be a Torah prohibition. Nami ein la'asor, but I'm not going to say this either. It's not a problem. Why? Since it's only for people with deafness, with hearing impairment. And this is very important in halacha. When Chazal made gezeras, rabbinic fences, if you like, they only made them on common situations. They didn't make them on small minority situations. Hearing aids are sufficiently minority within society that Chazal would not have made a gezerah. Of course, you can tell me that hearing aids didn't exist, they weren't included. But even within the general issue of tikkun kli, they didn't make that on things that only a small number of people are involved in. They didn't make gezerahs that apply only in rare cases, and therefore I don't think that hearing aids would have ever come within this. It's interesting. He knows when he wants to say something is awesome, when he wants to say it's mutter. He clearly wants to tell you the hearing aids are fine. Remember the tshuva about the time switches, where he clearly wants to say that they're not fine? And he says, well, even if they're not mutter, they should be prohibited, and the Chazal would have prohibited them. Maybe they did. Here he's going in the opposite direction. He clearly wants to let you wear your hearing aid on Shabbos. He says, no, I don't think that would have been included. And it's also very important. Why is it very important for someone to wear a hearing aid on Shabbos? Because people really need it. Because if they don't have their hearing aid in, yesh chashash pikuach nefesh. There's pikuach nefesh. Because when they go outside, they won't hear the cars. And they'll walk across the street, and they won't hear a car coming, and God forbid. Now, I don't know if you would have assumed that was really what people need their hearing aids for. Or not, but that's what he says here. And certainly they would not have made a gezer in that situation. And since it's not included in the rabbinic prohibition of tikkun kli, because it's a minority thing, and there's a good reason for you to be wearing it, we're still concerned you might play with it. So put a little sticker or something, he says, on the place that you might come to fix it so you remember not to. Now this is very important. If there was a real rabbinic prohibition, we would never have said, oh, just put a little sign there and you'll be okay. Because we say lo plug. I'll give you an example. Lo plug means we don't differentiate when it comes to drabonos. Well, if you'll remember, you won't remember, he'll remember, she won't remember. For example, you're not allowed to have uncooked food or semi-cooked food on an open flame. Why? Because you might turn up the flame. So Chazal say you have to cover the flame. So you say, well, you know something, I'm not going to cover the flame, I'm not going to use a blech, I'm going to put a big sign up on Shabbos over my oven, and it says, Shabbos Kodesh, don't forget not to turn up the flame. It doesn't work. Chazal said you have to cover the flame. Oh yeah, but I won't forget, I'm special. Lo plug, we make this for everybody. For example, you're not allowed to read by a light which is an open flame in case the light starts to flicker on Shabbos, in case the light starts to flicker and you might come and play with the candle. Oh, what if it's I fix it up on the wall, so I'd need to bring a ladder and I'd need to crawl up the wall in order to fix the... No, lo plug. We don't make any exceptions. If Chazal say it's osa, it's osa. What Rav Moshe Feinstein has done here, he's saying, since it's not included within the rabbinic prohibition, now I can talk about little signs and little things to remind me, etc., because I'm not in the prohibition. I just have to be sensible. For example, light switches. Do you have to have a little cover on your light switch on Shabbos? No. Chazal never made a gezerah that I might switch a thing over here to turn on a light over there. Is it sensible to do so? Maybe. Maybe. Do you have to? No. Then you can get into a discussion of what you'd like to and what you wouldn't like to do, etc. So here too, he says, it could well be that the hearing aid, which of course are allowed to wear, you should put something on it. Now you're going to say, well, this doesn't apply to modern hearing aids, and we'll come to that when we get there. There's lots of different types of hearing aids. We'll talk about that when we get there. So that, for these reasons and for others, Rav Moshe says that a hearing aid is not a problem. Don't forget also, before we leave this page, Av Shamilsa, when we said machinery that makes noise, even if that were an issue, remember the Sfardim say it's not an issue. Remember that? And even for the Ashkenazim, they say it's not an issue if there's a real need. Well, there's a real need. So we're not going to have a problem with the hearing aid on Shabbos. Should it be turned on? Yes, if you can turn it on before Shabbos, should be turned on before Shabbos. Now, some of them turn themselves off. You might have to turn it on again. And I brought you on the top of page 5 that most of the poskim say that if you can have it switched on before Shabbos, then you should do that, because it could be a rabbinic prohibition to switch the thing on. But if it's not switched on and you need to switch it on, then you can do that with a shinui if you possibly can. Why? Because switching on the hearing aid is almost certainly a rabbinic prohibition. The electricity involved. Remember when we talk about electricity, the halacha of electricity is, other than the Chazon Ish, who rules that electricity in any form pretty much is a Torah prohibition of bona, the vast majority of poskim do not follow that. They say it's a rabbinic prohibition of moilid, probably moilid, that you're introducing new life, a circuit into the circuit. And since it's a rabbinic prohibition, if that, we're not getting into all of the gedarim of electricity, once you're dealing with someone with a hearing aid and they're a chola, we already established they're a chola she'ein b'sakana, so they can do a rabbinic prohibition with a shinui, if possible to do with a shinui, if necessary to do without a shinui, so they can turn it on Shabbos. That also applies to turning it up on Shabbos as well. They should do that. They can do that with a shinui. Turning things up, by the way, is less problematic usually in the old models than turning them on. Because even if you compare electricity to moilid, what's moilid? There was the classic tshuva on this is Rav Yitzchak Shmelkas at the end of the 19th century. He says turning on a circuit is like introducing a new power into, or a new force, a new quality into something which didn't have it before. We have an example in the Gemara of someone putting scent into clothing. The clothing had no smell, and you put a nice smell into the clothing. That is a rabbinic prohibition. He says, I think that's the same with electricity. Okay, you can debate that. But there was never a problem of mosif smell, mosif moilid. Meaning if it already smells and you want to make it smell a little bit more, then that's always been fine. So turning up the volume is less problematic because you're simply changing a current that's already there, and that would have been prohibited even by poskim who are less happy to turn it on, and certainly by those who are happy even to turn it on. They can certainly turn it up. What about today when it's not a dial anymore? Turning up a hearing aid today is not just a question of moving a dial. It's pressing new buttons to turn the volume up. So Rav Shlomo Zalman says, no, that's still the same. You could do that. If you can do it with a shinui, do it with a shinui. But again, we're dealing with the drabanon for someone who is classified as a chola. And therefore, that's a relatively straightforward issue. Now, modern hearing aids raise all sorts of new questions. I've raised them here. They have things that I don't really know what they are, but I'll tell you anyway. Beam forming, where they focus on special directions. They filter out background noise. They synchronize between the hearing aids. Rav Asher Weiss has a very interesting tshuva. He says that all of these things are happening automatically. You're not even aware of what the hearing aids are tuning into and tuning out of, and therefore they can be allowed to do this on Shabbos. If you can disable things that beep and bleep and do these kind of things on Shabbos because you don't really need them, then disable those modes before Shabbos if you remember to do that. But if you don't remember, then at the end of the day, these are all background electronic things which are happening without your knowledge. And therefore, that deals hopefully fairly clearly with the issue of turning on the hearing aid and turning up the volume on the hearing aid. Rav Moshe actually is very interested not in the person wearing the hearing aid, but the person speaking to the person wearing the hearing aid. Look at number 8 for a second. This is a fascinating tshuva. He says, "V'hinei levadze," apart from all of this conversation about the hearing aids, Hacheresh, the hearing impaired person, sheba'ozna munach hamachona, that they're the ones with the machine on their ear, with the device on their ear, they're not doing anything. They've just got the thing on their ear. V'hanidam, the real question is, hu ala medabrim? It's not, are you allowed to wearing hearing aid? It's, are you allowed to talk to someone wearing a hearing aid? Because you, the talker, are making all the electricity change. And Rav Moshe takes this actually quite seriously. People who are talking in the background noise, they don't have to worry. They don't have any kavana to cause the hearing aid to go off. You're just talking in the crowd. It's something which is not intended, mutter, and that's mutter. It's not definitely going to activate the hearing aids. Sometimes the person even with the hearing aid can't hear what's going on in the background. It's the people who are talking directly to the deaf person, to the hearing impaired person, whom it's kaven. They intend the hearing aids to work. And it happens many times. It's a psikresha. You're definitely making this thing go off on Shabbos. Now, you can see here why this is a bigger problem. The person wearing the hearing aid is a choile. They're not so worried about the drabonons. They can do them with the shinoi. The person speaking is not a choile. Therefore, what halachic heter do they have to? Now we'll see. There's a whole issue of kavod habrius, which we'll get to in just a minute. But we'll get there in just a minute. I think that's what you're going to ask me, but we'll see. So then he says, and therefore, if it's possible, this is a remarkable psak. It's better not to speak to someone on Shabbos directly if they're wearing a hearing aid. And it's going to make the machine work. And obviously, people wear the hearing aids for background hearing. I want to hear the laning. The guy laning is not laning to me. He's laning to the shul, and I'm picking it up. Agav. The guy, the chazan, is not chazaning to me. They think they are. Okay. The rabbi, everyone knows the rabbi is definitely not talking to me. Okay. That's for sure with the rabbi's drasha. But he says when someone's talking to you directly, that's a problem. And therefore, he says a remarkable thing. And therefore, if you're talking to someone wearing a hearing aid on Shabbos and they ask you a question, you shouldn't really answer them directly. You should kind of hint to them because you don't want to speak and activate their hearing aids. And he says, but if that's not possible, then you can. It's not really osa. It's really permitted, but it's better to avoid it because what's your heter? You're not a chole. Now, this is a remarkable psak, and many people do not like this psak at all. And I brought you on the top of page 6 the hesped that Rav Aaron Lichtenstein gave on the funeral of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach in 1995. And I want to quote you what he says here. He says, once I visited Rav Shlomo Zalman, and I asked him about the issue of wearing a hearing aid on Shabbat. He permitted it, which we know. And so did Rav Moshe, but he permitted it. At the same time, he told me, I can't believe it. Someone sent me a letter from the States saying that Rav Kotler, so it wasn't just Rav Moshe Feinstein, was careful not to talk to a person wearing a hearing aid on Shabbos for fear of speaking into the hearing aid and thereby performing a malacha. He, Rav Auerbach, told me that he didn't believe this. Imagine, as if it's not enough that this person has been punished by heaven and that he's deaf. The Gemara states that if someone is wounded in such a way that he becomes deaf, he's paid full damages. Someone hurts another person and they lose their hearing, it's full damages, as though he ceased to function altogether, as if he died. This punishment isn't sufficient, he said. Imagine, you meet him in the street and instead of greeting him, you say, For him, says Rav Lichtenstein, this was completely out of place. He couldn't bring himself to believe that this is what the situation required. Very interesting as to how that works. And again, it's a little unfair. Rav Moshe Feinstein is not here to defend himself on this particular issue as to why he said that. Would he still have said that? Leave that aside. But that's, on the issue of speaking to people with hearing aids, that's also not a problem as far as most poskim are concerned. Let's talk about kavod habrius. Very important, because our heterim that we've been looking for have been based on a chola. And that's why we said that the person speaking to the person with the hearing aid might not have that heter. So look here, the kavod habrius is a very important concept, meaning we go a long way to prevent public embarrassment of individuals. Look at number 10. So the Gemara says, I'm not getting into the massive detail, but let's give an overview. If you find shatnez in your clothing on Shabbos, or any day, not just on Shabbos, if you find shatnez in your clothing, poshtan, you have to rip them off. Afila b'shuk, even if you're in the middle of the street. My timer, what is the reason? You can't rationalize mitzvahs. You don't know, God said don't wear shatnez, period, don't wear shatnez. Yeah, but it's going to be embarrassing. I'm sorry, It's embarrassing for you to do an Aveira in public, so take the shatnez off. And you're standing there with no clothes on. Says the Gemara, Kol makom sheyesh chilul Hashem, if there's going to be a chilul Hashem because you break a mitzvah, ain't cholkin covered, l'rav, even to a rav, even to someone of importance, dignified, nature, you don't give them special treatment, they have to rip off the clothes. Says the Gemara Tashma, but didn't we learn Godel covered abrius shedoicha es loisa aseh b'Torah? Isn't covered abrius public embarrassment so serious that we set aside a Torah mitzvah? So why can't you keep the shatnez on? It's so embarrassing to take the clothes off. Va'amai, why would you set aside a mitzvah? You can't rationalize away mitzvah. Tirgama Rav Bar Shva. So Rav Bar Shva explains this. Kamedu Rav Kahana in front of Kahana, but lav deloy sasor. No. When the Brisa said you can set aside a Torah mitzvah to avoid embarrassment, that's the Torah mitzvah of lo tasur, of not deviating from the words of the rabbis. I.e., you can set aside a rabbinic mitzvah to avoid embarrassment. Kol mili derabbanon, all rabbinic prohibitions, asmechinu alav de loisasa, are all based on that Torah prohibition of loisasa, mishum kvoido, sharu rabbanon. And because of kavod habrius, the rabbi said he was okay. So we have a whole new concept. When it comes to kavod habrius, you're allowed to break, it's not really breaking, a derabbanon to avoid public embarrassment. Says the Tzitz Eliezer, number 11. Lamadnu miha'ama. We've learned from what we've analyzed in this tshuva. The hutra isu tiltul muksa. One of the examples they give is you're allowed to move muksa on Shabbos. Let's say they used to have stones in order to clean themselves after the bathroom. They used to have special smooth stones that they used. They didn't have paper in those days. They used to have stones. What happens if you forgot your special stones and you were caught in the middle of a field, you need to use the bathroom, whatever? You can pick up a stone, you can pick up a suitable stone. That's muksa. How can you break muksa? Yeah, but it's embarrassing. You need to be, hygienic. You need to be clean on Shabbos. You're allowed to do that. He says, we've said you're allowed to break that. Mishum kavod habrius. Shelo yitbazeh ha'adam. So a person shouldn't be embarrassed. Migramat I hatiltul, because they're not allowed to move it. Be'ene atzmo, it shouldn't be embarrassed themselves. Be'ene habrius, in the eyes of others. Ube'ezeh derech shehu, in whatever way. Im kein lefizeh. Hari nidma, it seems to me, says the Tzitz Eliezer, there is no greater imperative of kavod habrius, of giving people dignity and honor. The best example is taking away someone's embarrassment, ubizayon, and public degrading. From a person who's hearing impaired. What could be more embarrassing and distressing to someone that they can't hear what people are saying? And therefore, you are allowed to breach a derabbanon, even if you say it's a derabbanon, to make the hearing aids work. Of course you're allowed to do that. What are you're going to sort of hint to the person? You're going to mumble to the person? It's a major kavod habrius issue. You can't imagine the embarrassments and the distress of someone. And the unpleasantness. If they have to go in the public, or Bet HaKnesset and in shul, for who boded, and they're effectively isolated. But boded and people, he's not part of the public. And he doesn't really know what's going on. And he can't answer people. That is a terribly embarrassing situation. I think this is even worse than the cases of the Gemara with the stones. It's so embarrassing for this poor person. And then look at these last two lines, very important. The odzod, and even more. This terrible embarrassment, is mixed with a lot of pain, of distress. He can't daven properly in public. He can't hear the chazan. Shmias kriyas Torah. He can't hear the Torah. Amen yehei shmei Rabba. He can't answer Amen yehei shmei Rabba. Ukedush, he can't answer kedusha kedome bebitl kiyum chavil mitzvot kalot v'chamurot. He doesn't say, this poor person, he can't hear the laning. He's not doing the mitzvah of laning. He says this poor person feels distress because he can't or she can't hear the laning. It's not about them not doing the mitzvah. It's how they feel, this terrible feeling of isolation. He says there's nothing to talk about. Kavod habrius is clearly a hetzer. Now, that will give you a hetzer to do a drabanon, but not a doraita. Will it give you a hetzer to do a doraita with a shinui? That's a big debate, which I'm not going to get into in too much detail here. There is a case brought down in the Gemara of whether a person who has embarrassing food stuck in their teeth is allowed to make a makeshift toothpick on Shabbos. And the Gemara, and this is very embarrassing. You've got this piece of food kind of hanging out of your mouth or looking very unsightly. And everyone says, you've got to do something about that. You can't go out looking like that. So the Gemara says you're allowed to take a piece of straw, which is not a normal thing for a toothpick, and like fold it over and do something with your mouth. But you can't pull a splint of wood off something, because that would be a real toothpick, d'oraisa. If you put a knife on it, that would be a Torah malacha to make a toothpick from a piece of wood. But he says you can't do that. Why can't you do it with your hand? Pull a bit of wood off. It's a shinui. Yeah? Says the Mishnah Berurah, because you can't do a Torah prohibition with a shinui for covered abrias. Why? Because you should have known in advance and had some toothpicks with you. You know, this is something you could have done on Friday. But the Mishnah Berurah says, but in a case where you couldn't do it on Friday, maybe you'd even be able to pull one of these little toothpicks off and pick your teeth with it as well. So Rabbi Bush in the article there says it could be for covered abrias, maybe, and he's very tentative, you could even do a Torah prohibition with a shinui like that case before. Now, this is going to all by way of a rather long-winded introduction to our basic question, which is what are you going to do about your batteries on Shabbos? So let's have a little look on page number 7, please. Or page number, 6. Let's start with page number 6 at the bottom with changing the batteries. Now, the older models of hearing aids had disposable batteries. I know a little bit about this, because I researched, you'll see some of the weird things I had to research to prepare this year. But my son actually, who's obviously quite young, he actually has a hearing aid. He has a hearing issue in one of his ears. So I've talked to him a little bit about these things. The older models used to have disposable batteries. You throw them away every 3 or 4 days. You change them, etc. Now, that shouldn't be a problem on Shabbos because you can plan in advance. They last 3 or 4 days. You don't have to change them on Shabbos. But there could be a surprise. You could have forgotten to plan in advance. It could just die because it uses all of the electricity quicker than you thought, and you ended up in a situation that you have to change the battery. Are you allowed to change the battery of a device which has died because the battery has run out? The answer is no. What is the prohibition? Potentially a Torah prohibition of tikkun kli. It's a dead device. It doesn't work. It's effectively broken. You changing the battery brings it back to life. There's a kind of tchiyat ametim. It brings it back to life. This is a Torah, potentially a Torah prohibition. Okay, so what can you do? So Rav Shlomo Zalman says, well, you can ask a non-Jew. You're a chole, you're a person who's hearing impaired. You can ask a non-Jew. That's great. That's fine if you have a local non-Jew who knows how to change your batteries. You can ask a non-Jew. Can you ask a non-Jew directly? So yes, according to Rav Shechter and Rav Willig, that a person who is hearing impaired, wearing a hearing aid is a choleh. You can ask the non-Jew directly. A piece of advice we'll see soon is maybe you should change the batteries before they completely run out. We'll see that soon. But they are your they're your options. What if you can't find a non-Jew? Are you allowed to change the battery yourself? Well, that's problematic. Because if it's a Torah prohibition, who says you can do a Torah prohibition because your hearing aids have run down? He says, but I'll do it with a shinui. Well, first of all, how exactly are you going to change one of these batteries with a shinui? Yeah? They're not exactly large. It's one thing opening the door with a shinui. It's another thing opening the case and getting the little battery things out and putting them in. People who wear hearing aids are often also slightly sight impaired and are not always the most dexterous with their fingers. So working out how to change these batteries with your knuckles and stick them in and out it may be just that you can't use a shinui, and therefore that's a problem and something which is not going to be very easy to do. And therefore, when it comes to changing the batteries, this is potentially a problematic issue. Now, I brought you some other options maybe as to how you could deal with that. However, recharging has changed the world of batteries. I imagine the people here have hearing aids. I imagine there's a couple of people who might have a hearing aid here. They're probably rechargeable hearing aids. The way that I understand that they work, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that you have a little cradle which they kind of pop in. In many cases, it's plugged into the wall, okay, with a cable, and you put there's a red dot and there's a blue dot, and one's for the left aid and one's for the right hearing aid. Then you pop them in. I don't know if it makes a little beep when you put them in, or a little light comes on. Maybe it depends on the brand. Some yes, some no. Little lights, charging, green light, red light, orange light, all that kind of stuff. You pop them in, and when they're fully charged, you pop them out and put them in your ears. Are you allowed to do that on Shabbos? So most of the models that you can get now have a good 35, 40 hour charge if they're fully charged. Not all of them, but quite a lot of them. So if you plan in advance, then you shouldn't need to do it on Shabbos. 2 days of Yom Tov is going to be an issue. Another reason not to live in Chutz La'aretz if you're wearing hearing aids. But Rosh Hashanah, Yom Tov before Shabbat, Yom Tov after Shabbat, you're still going to have to think of how this works. So people do have to start thinking about charging their hearing aids on Shabbos. Are they allowed to do that? What are the implications of recharging a battery? So, like I said before, if the thing is completely dead, then bringing it back to life could be tikkun kli. Now, it's important to know in the halachas of tikkun kli, something which is derech tashmisho, the normal way that you use it, is not called tikkun kli. For example, take a door. Conceptually, the door is basically a piece of wall which is removable. Okay? The wall is blocked up. I have a sort of wood bit of wall. I open up the wood bit of wall, and the wall opens up. And then I close the wood bit of wall, and the wall closes up again. Why is it not prohibited to open and close the door on Shabbos? It's boina and soisa. You're breaking the wall and mending the wall every time you go through the door. The answer is because that's what the door was made for. That's not called fixing something. It's not broken. You're just using it. It's called using it. Rosh Shlomo Zalman says you're even, for example, allowed to change the gas canisters in a soda stream. Not just to put the air in, the soda in, but you're even allowed to change the gas canisters. Because, first of all, nobody waits till the gas canisters are completely empty to change them. Already you change them, it's kind of giving a nebuch bubbles rather than decent bubbles. And it's the way that you use it. It's not broken, it just needs a new canister. There's nothing broken about it. Whereas something with a battery which is completely dead is broken. If you can get to the battery before it completely dies, then that almost certainly downgrades the prohibition from a Torah prohibition, at least maybe to a drabon. It's not derech tashmisho, you don't use it in that way, normal, it's not a normal way of use, but maybe it's now a drabonon. And the source for this is a clock. Remember old clocks that needed winding up. So you have a grandfather clock in your house or a chiming clock. People don't have these anymore, chiming clocks in the house. Shulchan Aruch deals with it. Number 12. Zug hamakashkesh l'shaltz. If a clock in your house which chimes on the hour, asui al yidei mishkalot, and it's got weights, the weight, you need to rebalance the weights. Mutzah la'archo lahachinu min be'oid yom, you can set it all up on Friday afternoon, kedei sheyelech v'yikashesh kol Shabbos. Let it chime through Shabbos. Why is it not av shamilsa? Why is it not a problem of making a noise? Because you say, well, the Sfarim don't have that problem anyway. Okay, shkoyach. The Ashkenazim have the clocks as well. Okay? I don't know if more Sfarim or Ashkenazim had clocks or not. I suspect more Ashkenazim had those kind of clocks. The answer is because everybody knows you set it up in advance and it chimes on its own. It's automatic. It's not a problem on Shabbos. But what if it runs down on Shabbos? You're not allowed to wind it up on Shabbos, only on Friday. Says the Mishnah Berurah, number 13. Aval b'Shabbos loimi bo. On Shabbos itself, leave aside the problem. The im amad, if the clock stopped, the osel hachino, you can't reset it. Sheyelech, so that it goes now. Even if there's only just like a winding thing, you have to wave. Or I looked a little bit of research on how they sort of rewound clocks. I don't exactly know what he's talking about. This chut habarzel, this piece, this wire that comes out that you pull or you shake in order to wind it up. Shemitnanea v'yesh b'zeh issa Torah. This is a prohibition on a Torah level. The Kama poskim. Your clock has stopped. It's broken. You have to wind it up. Torah prohibition. David b'klal tikkun mana. It's tikkun kli. But if it's still going, it's just winding down. You're not allowed to wind it up and say, but this is drabana. This is drabana. Or betashen or. What if you have a tashen or? What's a tashen or? Pocket watch. There's a little thread that comes in that you pull to wind it up. Again, all the watches I could see you with a screw, with a key, or with a thing at the top. You can't do that, but that's the rabbanon. But for a chole, that's allowed. Why would a chole need a watch on Shabbos? You need pills at a regular basis, certain treatments. You have to replace the poultice or whatever every half an hour, etc. They had in those days. Yesh lahata. So then that's allowed because it's rabbanon for a chole. If it's still going, that's if it's still going. If you can't find a non-Jew. Again, always better to use a non-Jew. But if you find a non-Jew, even if it's stopped, a non-Jew can wind it up. So again, you have a classic application of this heter. If the battery is low, but it's still working, then recharging it is a drabonon, not a doraisa, like rewinding up a clock, etc. Again, we're not going to be worried about the electricity side of things for the reasons we said before, because the person with hearing impairment is a chole, and therefore if they put their battery, their hearing aids into the charger when it hasn't completely wound down, that is definitely going to be better, preferable. So don't let your batteries go down completely. Okay, so we'll see. The light you're not getting anything really out of the light going on, and that's a drabonon as well. And for the chayli, if you can use the shini. So what's the best way to do it? So I've brought you 3 options here. Number 1, ask a non-Jew to recharge your hearing aids. Well, that's great. But most people recharge their hearing aids before they go to bed at night, I suspect, and they probably don't have random non-Jewish people walking through their bedroom that they can just stop and ask to recharge their hearing aids. Okay, if you have a live-in caregiver, okay, that's different. But if you can't find a non-Jew, so the best answer the post can give is to put the charger on a timer, a Shabbos clock. You set it up on Friday so that it's going to be off, let's say from 10 p.m. when you go to bed at night. You're going to put your hearing aids into a non-active charger, which is clearly permitted, okay? It's going to turn on, let's say, at midnight when you're asleep. It's going to charge them all through the night. It's going to turn off again at, 7 a.m., you add whatever timing you need. And then when you take them out, it's also turned off. Isn't it grommer? You are causing it, like the dishwasher on a timer, remember? You're putting the hearing aids in. That's what's going to make it go on but grommer is permitted in the situation of need, and this is clearly a situation of need. So that's fine. That is by far and away the best way to do it that the post can bring down. Put the charger on a timer. The problem is, as technology advances, all of these nice, easy solutions become harder and harder. It's like turning off the light inside the fridge. It used to be the easiest thing in the world to put a piece of tape on the fridge. Now you have to call an engineer to retrofit, to pay extra to have deactivated the special set. So a lot of chargers these days are themselves battery powered, meaning the charger can be attached to the mains, but even when it's detached from the mains, it still charges because it has its own power. So the solution that I came up with just now won't work, because even if the power is off, the timer is off, the cradle still has charge in it, so when you put the hearing aids in, it's going to do its magic, etc. Unless you've allowed it to go completely dead, and okay, you could do that. Yes?
It's not causing it to go on when you put it in, if it's off with the clock.
Yeah.
It's working anyway when the clock goes up, whether you put them in or not.
No, it's not charging if you don't put them in, then they're not charging. If you do put them in, then they are charging.
You said you're causing it to...
But you're causing your hearing aids to charge. If you don't put them in, the hearing aids are not charging.
No, the hearing aids, but the machine is working anyway.
A good question. I don't know what charging machines do when you're not charging anything. I don't think they do much. I think they just sit there waiting for you to stick something in and charge. That's a good question. I'm not an electronic engineer. I will have to talk about that. So what's the best option if you don't have a non-Jew handy and you can't put your things on a timer? So one of the suggestions made is to put them into the live charger. But that could be a doraita. You can't do that for a chole. So make sure that they're not completely run down, number 1. So it's a drabanon. And then do it with a shinui. If you can do a drabanon with a shinui, then you're good to go. How you put these hearing aids in with a shinui is a good question. I'll leave you to think about that and send me answers on a postcard, okay? Are you allowed, however, let's say it's completely decharged, and you say, look, it's a Torah prohibition. Am I allowed to do a Torah prohibition with a shinui? Now, we said the Shulchan Aruch said no, but the Alter Rebbe said yes. And have a look here in number 15. The Mishnah Berurah doesn't like that psak of the Shulchan Aruch. He says, va'ayidei shinui leish la'ayin. This is talking about doing things on Yontef, medication on Yontef. Dinehi be Yontef Rishon, number 15. If it's Yontef Rishon, bevada yesh lahachmir. I don't think you should be doing anything, even with a shinui on a Torah level. It's a Torah prohibition. K'ma b'Shabbos, like Shabbos. Not the same as Shabbos, but it's a Torah prohibition. Even though there are examples in the Gemara of people apparently doing Torah prohibitions with the shinui, in order to deal with someone who is sick. And the example given is Gonech Sheyonek Chalav B'Shabbat. What's that case? This is a very unusual case. And I did a little bit of research into this as well. It used to be a therapeutic cure that the doctor would say to you, you have to suck milk from a live goat or a cow in order to cure your illness. And actually, if you look into this, you'll see this was much more common than you would have thought, especially with young children. They used to, feed them all the time from animals, apparently. Now you know why people turn out like they turn out, maybe. But on Shabbos, the Chazal said you're allowed to suckle from a live animal in order to cure your illness. 1 second, that's a Torah prohibition. To milk a cow, to milk a goat. How come you're allowed to do that? Okay, so it's for sure it's a shinui. That's not normally the way that you get the milk out. But how are you allowed to do that? Says the Mishnah Brura, Yesh loima, my answer is, Hasam de ein darko shel mefarig bakach. It's just completely a different thing you're doing. Lo chashin malacha klal. And this is a very important principle. That's not just called a shinui. That's called something completely different. Milking a cow and suckling directly from a cow are not just it's not just a shinui of the other. It's completely different. And when you have something called a shinui gomor, then you are able to do it. It says the Mishnah Brura, therefore, in a shinui gomor, like in that extreme case, and I can talk about a Torah prohibition. But anything else, no. However, if you go into the last page on page 9, just 1 second, I'm a bit conscious of the time. Rabbi Goldstein is going to appear any second. If you look at the number 16, you can see the Shmira Shabbos, however, brings down Rav Shlomo Zalman says, not so quick. It's not just the Alter Rabbi, it's not just the Eglei Tal, but it's also the Ksas HaChoshen and many others I brought down in number 16 that say you can rely on this, and therefore Rav Willig and Rav Shechter say that if really there is no alternative for your hearing aids on Shabbos, and the only way to charge them, because you need them on Shabbos, is to put them into a live charger, then if you can find a way to do it with a proper shinui, then you should do it with the other hand. Are you always particular? I understand writing with your left hand is a shinui because you never write with your left hand. But are you always particular to place your hearing aids with your right hand? I imagine most people don't even remember which hand they use to put things in. Okay, so maybe in your case that's different. So I brought you that as a permission as well. Of course, you could always be luxury oriented and have a second set of hearing aids ready for when you need. I'm not telling you have to do that because they, I'm sure, cost an awful lot of money. But that is a glatt kosher solution as well, but not probably a financial one. I just brought you finally on Yom Tov when it runs into Shabbos, then if you have to do the charging, better to do it on Yom Tov than Shabbos, because whatever we can do in order to minimize the prohibition we do, and Yom Tov is on a different level to Shabbos. But again, wherever possible, the shinui should be used. I hope that's helpful, interesting, some halachic issues, and certainly you can take them to a posek for more clarity. We will reconvene on the first Wednesday in September, Be'ezrat Hashem, where we will look at medical ethical issues going forward.